Okay, here we are, all live, I think. I'm going to be talking about this interesting question about storing energy, and people very often think of batteries. For example, we just changed the batteries in this little device right in here. I don't know if you've ever looked up the cost of a kilowatt hour of energy from a disposable battery. Now, I'm paying 14 cents a kilowatt hour from, to get electricity at the house. Do you know what it is for just something like a AA cell that's not rechargeable? Try 300 simoleons. $300 per kilowatt hour. You ought to try it sometime. Anyway, practically everybody knows that solar and wind can't make it by themselves, simply because, well, even most enthusiasts for solar recognize that night comes around, and enthusiasts for wind recognize that the wind dies down from time to time. So what are you going to do? We'll store some energy. But without that method of storage, those forms of energy are basically worthless. So I'm going to be discussing this matter a little bit. Little cartoon to begin with, sent to me by a friend of mine, still a friend. Certainly, a party of four at 7:30 in the name of Dr. Hayden. May I ask whether this is an actual medical degree or a mere PhD? Well, I did my work in atomic physics, but for a physicist, anything more complicated than hydrogen is understandable only by somebody the capabilities of Will Happer, who will speak later today. I'm not one of those. But we hear this mantra that solar and wind are cheap and getting cheaper. It's only a few cents a kilowatt hour. All right. Can you buy a kilowatt hour of midnight solar electricity for $1 million? Nope. The sun shines 24/7 only in places like Boulder, Cambridge, and Berkeley. Okay, can you buy a kilowatt hour of wind-generated electricity when the wind isn't blowing? No, not even a blowhard politician, but I repeat myself, can supply wind-generated electricity when the air is still. Oh, I forgot, what about storage? Well, there are numerous storage schemes. Pumped hydro, batteries, hydrogen, compressed air, flywheels, capacitors, molten salt, and they're going to say other, meaning I don't know what it would be. But we'll go into a discussion about how those things work a little bit later. Meanwhile, here's a generic graph of power versus time. And notice that the ordinate, the vertical axis, tells us what the power is, but the area between two vertical lines tells us how much energy was used, consumed, saved, whatever, during that particular time. So the amplitude is the power, and the energy is the area. And just to review, power is energy per unit time. Energy is power times time. People in the electrical field use energy in the units of kilowatt hours, which is 1,000 watts times 3,600 seconds. It's called a kilowatt hour. Physicists use the time unit of seconds. Okay, now the first one we'll talk about here just very briefly is what's called pumped hydro, because that's the only candidate in town. There are no others. Pumped hydro. Okay. You'll notice I have a column there marked in red, and that's hydroelectric pump storage, and you'll notice down there that the numbers are negative. All those storage systems are net losers, but sometimes you want a net loser simply because it makes other things work better, and that's good enough for the kind of people I run around with. Now, down in Queensland, that's another place where the sun always shines. The university goes 100% solar energy. What do they mean by that? 100% of what? All electricity, all heat, all transportation, all the time? Or are they getting energy from elsewhere during the night and so forth? Anyway, the knee-jerk answers to these questions are: you can store solar energy during the day, use it at night, so midnight solar energy is available, and it's cheap. And the wind is always blowing somewhere, and besides, there's storage. We will have some discussion about those matters. But now we come to some things that kind of turn people's stomachs. It's called numbers. And we need to spend just a little bit of time with that. But the numbers for this purpose are not hard. And by the way, I'm using the arithmetic system where 1 + 1 = 3 for very large values of 1. For example, 1 + 3 + 1 + 3 is 2.6, rounded up. It's 3, right? Very large values of 1. Anyway, well, some cases we'll be dealing with sort of one significant figure. But I'm going to ask you, how much energy storage is required for an all-renewable system? Now you got to think about, like, what do I even mean? Because what units are we going to use? Well, we use energy on a day-by-day basis, and so we're going to ask, well, how many days storage do you have to get 99.9% reliability? Now, where I live, we have 99.99% reliability. In Connecticut, it was closer to 99. The difference being the number of trees. In Connecticut, trees fall on power lines. Woodsmen spare that tree. But 99.9% reliability basically means that you have power at your house, at your factory, or whatever, for all but about 9 hours a year. 8 or 9, something like that. If you are talking about the electronic level in, say, a big server building or something like that, a big data handling building, if you're talking down at the level of the integrated circuits that are making everything happen, we're talking about 99.99999%. And by the way, that was very important, and it'll be on the next exam. Hi, Jane. Okay. So how many days do you think you have to store energy for to attain that kind of reliability? Well, if you're in Las Vegas, you think, well, the sun is going to shine most of the time. You may have a day or two that get cloudy. If you live in New England, you might think, well, a day or two it gets sunny. Um, I live in Pueblo, West Colorado, and people there think it is good wind country. It is not. It has to be, you have to have much higher wind speed to have a good wind place like that. But days and days go by when you have poor sunlight, you have poor wind. So you might need something like 5 days energy storage. If you want to quarrel about it, quarrel. I'm just picking a number out of the air. Okay, then comes the question of how much power is required to charge the system. As you got something you're going to store energy in, and you're going to get 5 days storage, how much power do you have to juice that thing up? And then, how much power must the storage system turn around and be able to deliver? Those are the questions that we need to ask. So I'm going to tell you right now the main fact about storage, after which you can just go to sleep for a while. Because a lot of people think that physics is a good ad for Sominex. Okay, here is the main issue. Storage requirements for conventional sources are far cheaper and far smaller than for solar and wind. That's going to be the message. I'm going to show you. Question of quantity. Suppose you have a storage system. We're not paying any attention to what it is right now. It's just called X. We have a storage system. It could be pumped hydro, batteries, compressed air, molten salt, whatever. How much storage do you have to get something like 99.9% reliability, a day's worth, 2 days worth, 5 days worth? I'm not really quite sure, but I'm gonna choose 5 just because that's one number I can handle. I handle 1 and 5 and 10. I do 2 sometimes. Here are some data from California. This is a load curve. It comes from 2009, but it's going to be typical of other places and so forth. You notice down at the bottom it has something called base load, and that's the power that runs around the clock. Never shut it off. It just runs around the clock, and those sources are the cheapest. Coal, natural gas combined cycle, nuclear, and some hydro. Let me tell you about natural gas combined cycle, and you'll see why it's there. In an NGCC plant, you have the front end of the thing is a turbine engine, just like the one in the airplane that didn't fail, that brought you here, except it's just the same, except that it doesn't have any thrust. By an invention that took place at Pratt & Whitney some years ago, they found a way to make single crystal, some kind of advanced metal alloy kind of thing that they use for the turbine blades, because most crystalline things are polycrystalline, and those grain boundaries are where things come apart. So they make things out of single crystal. So the upshot is that they can run those Hummers at really high temperature, and you get really high efficiency. And they run something like 45% efficient or something like that. But the exhaust comes out hotter than a $2 pistol. So they run this exhaust through some big ducts, and a friend of mine has a factory in Pueblo where they make the ducting for it. And they send this hot exhaust over to a place where they now run a steam cycle. Well, then the steam cycle isn't terribly hot steam, but it works. So they put the two together, and I think the highest efficiency so far is something like 62%. They're really nice devices. Why not use them for the intermediate load in there? And the answer is, well, when you have a steam plant, you've got a big amount of thermal inertia to deal with, and you can't turn things on rapidly, and so forth. So the combined cycle units get used around the clock. For the intermediate load, typically people use natural gas and hydro. If you look up the data on hydro power plants and so forth, you'll find out that they have an annual capacity factor of something like 30%. And the reason is that those plants come on, say in the afternoon when there's a big demand for power. They have lots and lots of separate generators. The water runs through all those generators, generates a lot of that power. The water level goes down. At night, they turn them off, the water level comes back up. So they're overpowered, and deliberately they're made for handling intermediate load. Then there's the peak load, and you get out your billfold or your COVID-safe credit card. Now I'm going to consider this same thing using California as an example, where I have that yellow line there crosses about 4 hours. So from 10 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon, that's 4 hours out of 24, which makes 1/6. Well, that is a typical annual capacity factor for solar power plants. Okay, so now the amount of energy we have to store. Now we're talking about generating energy for 1 day's storage. Okay, so we want to generate the area under that curve, under the black line there. That's how much energy we want to generate, but we have 4 hours to do it in. Therefore, we have to have about 6 times as much as the average power in order to charge the whole thing up in 4 hours. So we have kind of an odd thing here. We've got a demand, an average demand of about 35 megawatts. I'm sorry, this is 35 gigawatts, giga. 10 of the, some say giga, some say giga. The word comes from giant. It is a tough audience, I want to tell you. Okay, so you got 35 gigawatts is average power, but you have to have a total of 6 times that. So you have to be able to generate 210 gigawatts. Okay, so that answers that question. Now, the total power then has got to be 6 times the average power. The return power requirement is not nearly as large as the charging requirement, because all you have to do is handle peak power. But anyway, that's what we have for California solar cell. Now this little graph right in here, you're going to have a little bit of trouble reading, but on the bottom is dates running from something like 1975 up to almost the present. And there are various lines, various categories of solar cell and so forth. And the vertical axis here is efficiency. So you can see that generally speaking, the efficiency of solar cells is increasing with time. So's the cost of the exotic stuff. Okay, the ones up there at the top of the graph are kind of thumbnail size things where people have developed them in their interesting little laboratories and so forth. But to make a long story short, the efficiency that you can buy for kind of large scale applications is running around 20%, which is better than the 10% of some years ago. But you see, the important thing here is that there is a trade-off. You want to generate a certain amount of power, you can use lots of cells at low efficiency or fewer cells at higher efficiency. So it really winds up being an economic, not a scientific discussion. Again, a reminder, solar cells produce no power when the sun doesn't shine, no matter what the efficiency is. All right? Okay. Now we'll go to wind. Now, wind works a little bit better. The annual capacity factor for wind machines is about 35% by design. Now, let me explain that very briefly to you. Imagine that you had a pinwheel attached to a 1 megawatt generator. What's the capacity factor going to be? 0. You're not going to generate any power with a windmill driving a 1 megawatt generator. So now we'll turn it around and say, suppose I have a 1 watt generator, sort of like the one on a bicycle for running a light, and I have a 200-foot diameter gadget spinning around. Well, I can always generate a watt, so I have 100% capacity factor. And both of them are absolutely worthless. So the engineering compromise back in the 70s was to settle on an annual capacity factor of about 20%, and that way they got to brag about their big, at that day, 100 kilowatt or 200 kilowatt generators. Then they wised up and found out that's a big waste, putting that expensive generator on that little pinwheel sort of thing, and they settled on about a 35% annual capacity factor. So the long and short of it is here that you have to have about roughly 3 times the average power. Again, the storage requirement is to supply all that energy that's under that top curve there. But you have to have, to get 35 megawatts average, you have to have 105, I'm sorry, these are gigawatts. 35 gigawatts, you got to have 105 gigawatts. Okay, so you got to have about 3 times the average power, and the return power again only has to equal the peak power. Okay, now we come back to reality land, and the previous graphs I showed were for 1 day's storage. What if you're talking 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days? Okay? You got to multiply those numbers by that. So in other words, you got to have tremendous generating power, and you have to have tremendous storage. Now I'm going to show you a rational alternative. Instead of having our baseload machines crank out just the baseload power and run all day long, instead increase that amount of power to equal the average. Now it's going to take something. You're going to have to increase it by, like 30, 40%. So, okay, you do that. But during the night, you can store some energy, and during the afternoon, you can release that energy. But the amount of energy that you have to store and the amount of energy you have to release is running something like 1/4 of one day's power, or one day's energy. So you're storing 25% of a day's energy instead of several days' energy or something like that. And the power you have to have is only roughly 30-40% more than you presently have, versus quite a bit more if you're dealing solar and wind. So just increase the conventional power to equal the average power. Storage requirement is about 1/4 of a day's energy. Storage power requirement is 25% of the average power. No big deal. You can handle it. Okay, so here are the requirements for 99% reliability, and in this case I have specified that we're going to have about 5 days energy storage. For solar and wind, we have to have somewhere around 20 to 30 times the average demand instead of the average demand. And we're going to have 100% of the peak power available from storage. For enhanced base load, we have to have 1/4 of a day's energy stored. Charging power, 1/4 of an average power, and the enhanced base load, we only have to store 1/4 of the average power from storage. So solar and wind are worse by a factor of maybe 20 for the energy storage, somewhere between 80 and 120, depending on how it's balanced, for the charging power. And for the handling the peak power, you're different by a factor of 4. Let's see here. Okay, then there's the small matter of efficiency in storage and retrieval. Now, I left that out because the storage and retrieval problem is largely, but not quite, the same for conventional as it would be for wind and solar. So here we go. And another common claim is, well, the sun is shining somewhere and the wind is blowing somewhere. All we need is a big enough grid. Now, these are the very people, by the way, who are saying, let's go to microgrids. There's a little irony there. Okay, let's say, well, there's a difference of some time, because the sun moves across from east to west, but nighttime comes to New York and Arizona alike. And the air can be calm over very large regions. Very large regions. I mean, you just look at your weather map and you will see that. So there's a reason that the annual capacity factor for wind is 35%. Air speeds below 4.5 meters a second are worthless to wind turbines. The wind turbine just sits there. It's not turning fast enough to generating any power. Power varies dramatically with wind speed, and I'm going to show you that part in this graph right in here. This graph, the left-hand graph chart over there, is talking about the wind power class in watts per square meter. Now, this is slightly phony terminology because you don't really talk about watts until you talk about a conversion of energy, okay? But what they're imagining then is a square meter. How much wind, how much energy in the wind comes through that square meter in a second? So it'll be in watts per square meter. And anyway, they go by various classes. And outstanding class is something like 700 watts per square meter. That's that 6 that you see on the left over there. And on the right, I have a graph of output from industrial wind turbines. Now, this graph right in here is quite typical. In other words, if you go to some company like GE or Vestas or Goldwind or some of those others, and you pull out a graph showing what's the power as a function of the wind speed, they all look the same. The only difference is, well, you got a 1.5 megawatt generator, you got a 1.8, or you got a 2.0 or 2.5. But put in terms of percent of nameplate, they all look the same. That's that black line that you see there. And what I want to call your attention to is the slope of that black line, say between 6 and 13 meters a second, roughly in there. That's a very steep line. Okay? In principle, the power in the wind goes up with the cube of the wind speed. But that doesn't work down at zero. Anyway, that's the origin of that nice straight line in there. The line, if there is a small change in the wind speed, there's a big change in the power. See what I mean? Let me go over here and stand right in front of this thing. Imagine going from this wind speed to this wind speed. The power has gone from here up to there in a New York minute. That makes it very, very hard to keep the line voltage stable when there's a lot of wind power on it. Okay, the second part of that graph that I want to show is that red line, which is showing, let's just call it in relative terms, the amount of time that the wind speed is at a certain value, give or take. Okay? Now it turns out that about half the time the wind speed is such as to generate less than 50% power. About 11% of the time you get full power until you get up to about 25 meters a second, in which case you better shut that baby off or you don't have a wind turbine anymore. So, I mean, we're talking here about the nature of wind in an excellent site, outstanding site, okay? Okay, that's the untold story of wind. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the grid. This graph right in here is from the Energy Information Administration Agency, EIA. What it's showing is the flow of electricity. I'm not showing the inputs to it, but the thing I want to call your attention to is down there where it says T and D losses. T is transmission, D is distribution. T and D losses are about 6.2%, and this was year 2011. Anybody know the difference between transmission and distribution? Transmission is high voltage, like, 200 kilovolts, 100 kilovolts, 200 kilovolts, 750, a megabyte, a megavolt in some cases where they go to DC. The distribution is what they have going around your city, around your neighborhood. It's typically 40, 20 kilovolts, something like that, and then they bring it into your house at 110, Okay, anyway, the T and D losses, which involve all the resistive losses in the wires, the radiative losses in the wires, the heat that's generated in the transformers and so forth, amount to about 6% of the power that's on the line. That gets some people's nose out of joint because they actually, you find out people make a mistake. They will talk about how inefficient the grid is. And what they're doing is not talking about the grid, but about the way we generate electricity. If you use a system which converts heat into motion, that is governed by the second law of thermodynamics, And this is why, well, just the process of converting heat to work is notoriously inefficient, but we're doing pretty well when you get up to 62%. Okay, anyway, they talk about those losses converting heat to electricity as if they are part of the grid. That is not the case. The grid itself is responsible for only about 6% of the loss. Okay, yeah, the sun is shining. It's always available somewhere. Sun is shining in Arizona, but Philadelphia needs power. The wind is blowing in North Dakota, but we have to ship it off to Los Angeles. High winds in Florida. Well, we got to be careful about that because when they get up to hurricane level, we have to shut them down. Power is needed in Chicago, etc. But the long and short of it is that in order to make this whole system work, you have to have pretty much every location capable of generating all the power you need. I'm exaggerating a little bit. My mother told me 50 million times not to exaggerate. Okay, so suppose we go to this much bigger grid that they call the microgrid. What will be the T&D losses when Arizona provides New York with solar electricity? What will be the T&D losses when West Texas provides New York with wind-generated electricity? Do you agree it might be more than 6%? Yeah, we'll see. I don't know. Now we're going to talk about energy loss in storage. You have energy, you lose energy when you pump it into a storage system. And then you also lose energy that is stored by leakage, and how much depends on what kind of a system you have. I mean, for example, if you have a cavern with compressed air in it, maybe some air leaks out through the cracks in the rock, something like that. If you have put this battery on, take a brand new battery and just set it aside for a couple of years and see how much energy you have left. You've lost a certain amount, and so forth. Some more than others. And energy is lost when you transfer it from the storage system. There's some just round-trip efficiency, which is necessarily less than 100%. And those will be counted as grid losses because they're part of the grid. No, they're not part of the generating system. Okay, now we got a couple of icons about free renewable energy. This is the effectiveness of subsidies. And this graph is a little bit old, but I had my hands on it, so I just grabbed it up here. These are electric subsidies per unit of production. It's in 2010 dollars per megawatt hour. Okay, there's one for you. Solar, not to scale, $77.64 a kilowatt hour. And you can compare that with the subsidy people complain about. Oh, the nukes and the coal, they're getting such a big subsidy. Well, they produce something. Okay, and there's also the subsidy that if you have solar and wind, they really can't run on their own. They have to have other power plants. Now, typically, let's say the wind is up a little bit and you got your turbines turning. You got to run your conventional power stations at roughly half power, because they have to be able to go down as well as up. In other words, a big gust of wind comes up and you generate a lot of power. You got to shed some power or produce less. On this regard, by the way, I should say that we have a power station in Pueblo that uses some General Electric, I can't remember what, something dying. some fancy name. But those are gas turbine units that can go from 0 to full power in 15 minutes, which is really, really very, very nice. Why'd they get them? Well, the same company has wind, and they have to be able to compensate for the wind. So without the backup, the solar and wind are basically worthless. And here is a graph that I came across sometime. Power blows past $9,000 cap in Texas as heat triggers emergency. But I just want you to look at that graph showing how much power is generated by the wind throughout one day. You want 99.9% reliability. Would you agree with me that it's not particularly reliable? Okay, this is not the final slide, but it's a beauty. Quote from Mark Jacobson and Mark Delusion. We estimate that around 3,800,000 5-megawatt wind turbines, around 49,300 megawatt concentrated solar plants, around 40,300 megawatt solar PV power plants, around 1.7 billion 3-kilowatt rooftop solar PV systems, 5,350 100 megawatt geothermal power plants, 270 new 1,300 megawatt hydroelectric power plants, 720,000 0.75 megawatt wave devices, and 490,000 1 megawatt tidal turbines can provide a 2030 worldwide system world that uses electricity and electrolytic hydrogen for all purposes. Remember, small is beautiful? Okay. Now I'm going to talk about storage systems, if anybody's still awake. First, pumped hydro. What does pumped hydro look like? You have a low reservoir and you have a high reservoir and a pipe running between them. When you have excess power, you pump water from the lower reservoir up to the upper one. When you need some power, you let the water run down through the same pipe, and it turns a turbine, which turns a generator and generate electricity. The difference between the graph on the left and the one on the right is that the one on the right is with a closed system where you don't have any water flowing in or flowing out, and the one on the left is where you have water flowing out. We have one such system in Colorado called Twin Lakes, and I tried to get in there and find out some data once, but you know, I'm not one of the privileged people, and after 9/11, they don't let people do things like that. There's one in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, that uses the Connecticut River as the lower reservoir, and they have some lake in the mountains nearby. Well, I don't know how near it is, but it's miles, many miles. Okay, now most of the pumped hydro storage was built in the 1970s, and I've got this graph over here showing that is net negative storage, or net negative energy. But now I'm going to do some numbers here. It says they're typically losing around 5 terawatt hours. This is in a year. And the average power in there is about 25 gigawatts, you know, more or less 10 times 2.5 or so. So the loss is about 2%, which isn't too darn bad as far as I can see. Okay, now I'm going to talk about another storage scheme, which is called batteries. And you look at this graph and you say, okay, when did people install how much and what kind was it? And the long and short of it is that most of it was lithium batteries. There's a little bit of sodium battery in there, you can see in there, but this is an interesting topic we're going to have to say just a little bit about, because you see the world doesn't have all that much lithium. But if you look at the numbers, it's Zippo. On a grid scale, it's zero, nothing. Okay, so anyway, let me first talk about the battery in your car. The voltage runs around 12.6. Now, that's a slightly temperature-dependent number, but we're going to call it 12.6. When you're charging your battery, your regulator on your alternator will run at something like 13.6. You know, it's about a volt higher than the 12.6. When you run your, and the faster you charge it, the higher the charging voltage. When you discharge it, such as when you're starting your car, which is about the only time you'd run a discharge, the voltage might drop down to something like 12, 11.8, 11.5, depending on the condition of your battery and so forth. But the faster you consume it, the lower is the discharge voltage. And the energy loss is what lies between. Because the voltage is energy per unit charge, and anyway, that area in there represents lost energy, and you can see that that's running around 15%. It's a good enough number. Okay. Now there's a whole new issue of the chemical and engineering news. They had a special report about batteries, and most of it is about various exotic ways of using lithium. Now, lithium has some advantages. It's the lightest metal. Well, technically hydrogen is a metal, but it isn't very hard. It's very reactive. It's very high electronegativity. The lightweight of the lithium makes it good for transportation. You don't want heavy batteries, you want light batteries. For stationary applications, it's no big deal, you know, who cares? But lithium is not all that abundant. So let me have just a few words about that. This is the periodic table showing lithium in the upper left corner there with sodium directly below it. And it's a pretty light metal. Now, that's the chemist's periodic table, right? The physicists also have a nice little table. It's called the chart of the nuclides, and there it is. That has all of the isotopes of all of the atoms. And lithium is this stuff down here in the lower left corner. Okay. Now, this is the part of that table showing lithium, and it has two stable isotopes and some unstable isotopes. Now we're going to do a little bit of exotic nuclear physics, all tied up in a graph. This graph shows what's called the binding energy per nucleon in MeV. And over at the left, you see lithium is circled. And if we can gain energy in nuclear reactions by fusing things together, going to the right, or going to the left, starting at uranium over there, until we get to the nuclear graveyard, which is around iron 56. And the only reason we have all these exotic things is they were created in supernovae. But binding energy per nucleon may not stick well in your cross, so I'll turn it upside down and make it look like an energy well. Okay? The lowest energy is down at the bottom. That's the lowest energy state. I just flip the graph over. If you can't read it, stand on your head. But you can see that the two isotopes of lithium are kind of ready to come apart. And here's an explanation why lithium is not very common. These are nuclear reactions that take place inside your local friendly supernova. Up at the upper left, we have some hydrogen atoms coming together, throwing off a neutron to make a deuteron, gets hit by another proton, turns into a triton, then it hits with a helium atom and forms. There's the helium-3, helium-4 collision, and it forms beryllium-7, which decays into lithium-7, which is sitting right down there. But lithium-7 gets hit by a proton and breaks apart into two helium nuclei. So there's a construction process and there's a destruction process going on. So we don't have a whole lot of lithium. So where are you going to find lithium? It has very largely the same chemistry as sodium. So where do you find sodium? How about salt flats? This picture is from Bolivia, and believe it or not, I didn't take that picture. But anyway, those salt flats there are 100 times the size of the Bonneville salt flats. And this is just a kind of a pretty picture of it. It evidently is a beautiful site, but they're mining that place, and I think there's a place in Tibet or someplace where they're getting their lithium. Okay, now we're going to another kind of a storage scheme called hydrogen. You can, everybody has done this way back in freshman chemistry. You can do some electrolysis and separate hydrogen from oxygen. And this particular graph shows that you could have liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen in separate tanks. And instead of a generator there, you can use fuel cells, but your whole idea is to turn it into electricity. So anyway, you got a LOX tank and a liquid hydrogen tank, but no bagels. Okay, so here's a hydrogen question. If you go to your local friendly compressed gas store and get a tank of hydrogen, where did that hydrogen come from? It did not come from electrolysis. It came from natural gas. It's just easier and cheaper to get hydrogen from natural gas than it is from water. That's a reminder. Oh, and something else that's kind of interesting about hydrogen, and that is that hydrogen just leaks into steel and causes hydrogen embrittlement. For those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a problem with Liberty ships going down in the Second World War. Remember that? You heard about it? Hydrogen embrittlement. The metallurgist named Carl Zapfa was the guy who figured it out, and the Navy set him up in his own lab to work on that problem. Okay, but there are other ways to store hydrogen. As you can compress gas, you can liquefy the hydrogen, and then you got various kinds of things, chemical matrices where you can store it and so forth. Whatever it is, they're all lossy. You lose energy going in, you lose energy coming out, you lose energy just during time. Another storage scheme is compressed air, where you have a subterranean cavity and you have compressed air in there, and the rock is, the overlay of the rock and so forth is high enough that the compressed air can't push rocks out of the way, though it could leak to some extent. But you have you compress air in there, and then you can take it out and run it through some kind of a generator. And there is such a place where they're actually using it. It's called the Huntorf or Hunfort CAES, that's Compressed Air Energy Storage Plant. Still in operation. It'll work, but there is a problem, and that is when you compress air, it heats up, and that heat is of no value to you. Okay, that's lost energy. Another storage scheme, and this one is in use, it's called flywheels. Well, the picture there shows a flywheel that is also a generator that, as it spins, as it spins, it's generating voltage, but it's switched off. You know, it's not switched to anything. You're generating voltage, doesn't mean you're generating power, so it's just spinning freely, and it's got a fair amount of energy tied up in rotation. They use these at big data centers where you have a problem. The power has just gone off, and you have to restore that power in a microsecond or something. That's where the switch kicks in. The generator, the flywheel keeps that thing running. It's slowing down, but during that time you start up your serious diesel-powered generation system. But this is small stuff. There is nothing that's grid scale. Another one is to use capacitors. I mean, people think about that. But the voltage versus charge is not like it is with a battery. The voltage increases with the amount of charge. And these are, on a grid scale, they're zip. They're nothing. But they are the first line of defense in an electronic circuit, because they can release energy on a nanosecond basis. Okay. The last one I'm going to talk about is molten salt. Now, the whole idea here is this. If you have, let's say you want to store energy in the form of hot water. We get water pretty hot. The hotter you get it, the more pressure it has, and the more corrosive it is. It's pretty awful, and it's a bit dangerous. But salt, like sodium, can be stored at high temperature but at low pressure. It isn't going to blow apart on you. So the whole idea is to have a storage system where you just store heat, and you take heat, say from sunlight, store it as heat in this molten salt, and then you can release the heat to run your generators and stuff. Molten salt storage is 33 times cheaper than lithium ion, it says here. Here is a scheme where you have a solar power tower, and you have a high temperature sodium source, and you got a low temperature sodium source, and you transfer one to the other. You pump the sodium through a heat exchanger, which heats up water, which turns to steam, which runs your steam generator, blah, blah, blah. And it's absolutely wonderful. Here's a new concentrating solar tower worth its salt, 24/7, called Ivanpah. Just went bankrupt. I don't know, maybe those are some engineering problems. But by the way, you know, they use computers to aim these mirrors so that they reflect off the sun. When I was a kid, I had a Boy Scout signaling mirror about this size. It had a nice shiny mirror on the front, and it had a circular mirror on the back and a transparent plus sign in the middle. So what you would do is, say the sun is up there, you hold this thing up like this, and you can see the reflection, or you can see in the reflection of the sunlight that comes through the cross on your cheek. And then you align that with the cross that you see here, with your target. You line the three, which is a purely analog process, and you can get the sunlight where you want it. I was pretty good at it, but I was only 10. Okay, you take their claims with a bucket of salt, something like that. And then we come to this thing called other. You know, they always talk about wind and solar and other. And they'll talk about storage schemes, this, that, and everything, and other. And exactly what does that mean? Okay, my feet are tired and you are tired. Questions?